Now, he called one of his rivals a fat butcher and said he didn't know the meaning of the word ethical. In possibly the most bizarre day of evidence at the Leveson inquiry so far, Richard Desmond, who owns the Express Group, clashed with his inquisitors over the way his newspapers treated the parents of the missing toddler, Madeleine McCann. Now, in a moment, we'll be hearing from the McCann spokesman, Clarence Mitchell, but first, our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davies, is here. So, Andy, give us the full details of what Richard Desmond said about the McCanns.
Well, you remember that 4 years ago, Kate and Jerry McCann successfully sued the Express newspaper group over reports that they'd been running which seemed to suggest that the McCanns had somehow been involved in the disappearance of Madeleine and a subsequent cover-up. Now, today, the hugely controversial owner of the Express newspaper group, Richard Desmond, said he apologised on behalf of the papers about that. What they did was wrong, he said, and it couldn't be justified. But then he gave this sort of rambling defence of freedom of speech, and in that, he seemed to suggest that the McCanns had actually been quite happy with how the paper had covered the story for some time, because he said, you know, it took them 4 months to make a complaint and to take legal action, and they only did so when they had a new team of lawyers. Now, that provoked the indignation of the, as you'll hear in a minute, of the normally measured counsel to the inquiry, Robert J. QC.
They were quite happy, as I understand, in articles being run about their poor daughter, because it kept it on the front page. I think it was only when new lawyers came along, who I think were working on contingency, that the legal, well, that's a fact. I'm sorry.
Mr. Desmond, I'm going to interrupt you. That must be a grotesque characterisation.
Well, I'm sorry, that's the facts.
Your paper was accusing the McCanns on occasion of having killed their daughter. Are you seriously saying that they were sitting there quite happy rather than entirely anguished by your paper's behaviour?
I'm sitting there saying...
Please just think about the question before you answer.
Well, I'm going to answer your question.
So he did go on to answer the question, but he simply reiterated his claim that it took the McCanns 4 months for them to take legal action, and only when they had a new legal team.
Well, Clarence Mitchell, what do you make of all that?
Well, I have to say that Mr. Desmond's memory is doing him a great disservice. Less charitably, I'd say he's been living in a parallel universe for the last few years. For him to suggest, as he did, as we've just heard, that Kate and Jerry were in any way happy with the broad thrust of Express Group coverage is as grotesque, as Mr. J said, as it is laughable. I'm very glad Mr. J picked him up on it. The reason they took time to sue, to take legal action, was simply because they had more important things to do, like look for Madeleine, deal with the authorities, their own private investigators, and then they were within their legal boundary of timing as well for suing later. And also, they felt that they didn't want to fall out with an important arm of the media. Media is an important partner in a search for a missing child. But they felt enough was enough. It had gone on for too long and a line had to be drawn.
Did they change their lawyers, and was it the lawyers' advice then to sue?
There was a highly professional, extremely competent and very efficient team from Carter Ruck who took this on and represented Kate and Jerry's defamation interests right the way through. They were constantly monitoring every piece of coverage across all newspapers, not just the Express Group. But by far, the Express Group was the worst offender for the grossly defamatory pieces that even Richard Desmond himself admitted that they had been running. And as a result, at the time of Kate and Jerry's choosing, not because there were new lawyers, or a number of law firms have advised them at different times. It was nothing to do with legal technicalities or legal timetables. It was simply that they felt enough, we have to stand against this, and hopefully it will bring a more responsible tone into the coverage, which frankly it did.
Have you had any contact with the McCanns today? What do they make of this?
I have regular contact with Kate and Jerry, as you would expect. They too monitor the evidence throughout Leveson. Of course, they gave evidence themselves. They're not saying anything publicly to add to their evidence. They hope that speaks for itself at the beginning of the inquiry. But of course, they're fully aware of what's been said. And I can tell you that they will just look at this and sigh in disbelief.
Just quickly, this argument that he published maybe 102 articles, 38 bad, 68 good, I mean, leaving aside his maths, is there an argument that with tabloid journalism you do have to accept the wheat with the chaff?
Well, from memory, no, not at all. From memory, and the lawyers may correct me on this, I think there were 108 specimen articles which were deemed to be grossly defamatory. That's not the point. One grossly defamatory story is unacceptable. The point was slurs, lies in some cases, unfounded allegations, entirely untrue, rumours, supposition, and frankly plain journalistic guesswork was coming out of Portugal, unchecked. There was precious little ability for the reporters to actually confirm things, but it would still go into the paper. If I said, as the spokesman on the ground, this is wrong, it's inaccurate, we're not happy, instead of it being balanced, it then became McCann fury over slurs, and the whole thing just snowballed. It was a mess. It was a fairly poor hour in the history of tabloid journalism all round, and this legal action was mounted really to stop it.
So, Andy, there was a lot more, wasn't there? What else did Mr. Desmond say?
Well, it was one of the most remarkable hearings this inquiry has witnessed, and it was a fascinating insight into the world of this media mogul, Richard Desmond. And he came across as a newspaper owner who had absolutely scant regard for the very raison d'etre of his industry, which was journalism. He said, stories don't sell newspapers, putting DVDs and offers on the front page do. He said the inquiry was possibly the worst thing that had ever happened to his industry because it was bad for business. And if he came across as a slightly isolated voice in the industry, he really came across as a fish out of water in this inquiry. It's an inquiry all about ethics, and that was a concept, as you'll hear now, he had a bit of difficulty grasping.
What interest, if any, do you have in ethical standards within your papers, or is that purely a matter for the editors?
Well, I'm ethical. I can't remember what the word means, but perhaps you'd explain what the word means, ethical.
So he went on to say that there was a fine line between ethics and morals, but when he was asked why he purchased the Express newspaper, you know, it came back down to the philosophy of the bottom line.
I may be wrong, but it was largely because it was commercially attractive. It was a business opportunity.
Of course, in the same way as Channel 5.
But apart from it being a business opportunity, is there anything else which attracted you to the idea of being a newspaper proprietor?
No.
He also had a go at his old rival Paul Dacre, didn't he?
Yeah, there was a theme here of victimisation, and you know, he had a go. He said he'd been scapegoated over the McCann case. He had a go at the regulator, the PCC, calling it a useless organisation which hated their guts at the Express, made up of phone hackers and the tea and biscuit brigade. But perhaps his most splenetic offering, if I could put it that way, was reserved for his arch rival, Paul Dacre, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mail. And this was a rivalry which provoked one of the most memorable exchanges of this inquiry, particularly when Robert Jay, the counsel to the inquiry, got Mr. Desmond's name wrong and called him Mr. Dacre.
You made it clear that the Daily Mail is, as it were, your worst enemy. Is that a fair way of characterising it?
I think it's Britain's worst enemy, the Daily Mail.
Well,
I think their tone on their tone and everything is so negative and so disgusting. You know that.
Yes, I think we just.
I think we will progress. Looking further on in your statement, Mr. Dacre.
I'm Desmond.
Sorry, Mr. Desmond. You've got me completely on the wrong.
Dacre is the fat butcher.
Now, that laughter went on for some time, but he did say eventually that he had no plans to buy other newspapers in the industry, perhaps to the relief of some observers today. He said it was a very tough industry, but he found today very tough. And as he was leaving, I went up to him in the corridor and I said, you know, how did you find that? And he said, terrifying. And I thought he was joking, but I said, no, how did you find that? He said, terrifying. And I said, how did you think you did? And he said, badly. So candid to the end.
Andy Davies, thank you very much. Clarence Mitchell, thank you for coming in.